Hello, my name is Gladys Kubrock, and I'm one of the 19 great-grandchildren of Ellen White. Ellen and James. She didn't do it by herself. And he was just, we don't hear enough about James because he was just equally a founder of the Adventist Church as Ellen White had to do with it. Many people ask me if I remember my great-grandmother. Well, it just happens that I came along just a little bit too late. I was born in 1922, and that was just 7 years after she passed away. But my brother, Virgil Robinson, and my sister, Mabel Robinson Miller, both remember grandmother. My brother Virgil was 14 years older than I, and my sister Mabel was 11. And so when I was growing up, I often said I have two mamas, Mama and Mabel, because she had to wait a whole year for me. I had been promised to her when my mother was, when Mabel was 8 years old. She kept begging for a brother, other sister. And my mother says, when you're old enough to take care of her. They decided that would be about 10 years. But when Mabel was 10 years old, we were on our way to Africa as missionaries. And so I happened to be born in Africa. And Africa has always been full of stories for me, full of remembrances. I spent my first 6 years in Africa. My father was the principal of a boys' school at the old Rusango Mission, which is now in the country of Zambia and is still going strong. We used to go out on mission trips. My father would go out to the villages to recruit new students for the school and to preach to them and show the lantern slides on the wall of a tent there. And the children would cluster around me, of course, and I had a little teddy bear that could growl. And when the children got too close to me for comfort, I would make him growl, and they would get scared and run away. And I enjoyed making these trips with my parents. And I loved playing with the little black boys and girls. We used to make cows and sheep out of mud and dry it, and have them to play with. In fact, when we came back to the States, at the time of our furlough, I was 6 years old, and I remember actually crying because I was so tired of seeing just white boys and girls. I wanted to see some black boys and girls. And this goes to show that our prejudices, or many of them, are just built in. They're not out of our natural feelings. But Africa has always been special to me. And in growing up, I always said, when I grow up, I want to be a missionary to Africa sometime. Well, I never had that privilege, although my brother and his wife spent 27 years as missionaries in Africa. But I had a different life, a wonderful life. I'll never forget Victoria Falls because it was so scary, and the mist from the falls was so great that we had to wear just like it was raining. And it was such a huge falls. I can never forget it. It was beautiful. Yes, that's one of the world's greatest wonders there. One of the questions that I was asked over and over when I would meet a group or a family, they would say, well, what was it like being a great-granddaughter? What is it like being a great-granddaughter of Ellen White? And I've thought of that. I'm 94 years old now, and as I look back on it, I can see that being born the great-granddaughter of Ellen White it was just a fact of life to me as a child. But as I grew older and I realized that many times special treatment was given to me, I realized that it was not me they were honoring, but it was someone that they loved dearly. I was just a real example of someone that they loved dearly. It was a tangible, just really a tangible evidence. And I'm sure that all the other great-grandchildren would join me too, because we were growing up, the devil treated us just like everyone else. In fact, I think sometimes he was more cunning to the folks that he's anxious to get on his side. But you know, when we're all the same at the foot of the cross, we're believers, and we never felt that we were any different from other people. And the ground is level at the cross. And that's the way I felt during my lifetime. It was a responsibility in many ways, but it was really a wonderful experience and blessings. My parents were godly. They sent me to church school. They sent me to a Christian Adventist college. And I've been eternally glad for that. They were godly parents. You know, there are so many stories that have been written about James and Ellen, especially Ellen right there. And my mother, in fact, has written a book that many of you have read, Stories of My Grandmother by Ella Mae White Robinson. And today I would kind of like to talk a little bit about my dad. I greatly admired my father. And his name was Doris Robinson, and he grew up in South Africa as a teenager. His parents had been sent there as missionaries in the late 1890s. And so as he graduated from high school, he was about 18 years old, and he loved to study, but he just trying to think what he should do for his lifetime when you turn that age. His parents had received a call to move to Australia to join up with a new school in Australia, but he didn't want to just follow his parents around, and he had been working for a Dr. Anthony there in near Cape Town. He had been going with him on cases, and the doctor was trying to persuade him to be a doctor. Well, he was interested in a way, but his mother said, "No, Dad, no, son, I am praying that you will be a minister." Well, my 18-year-old father said, "Mother, just stop praying that because I'll never be a minister." He says, "You know, the more I work for Dr. Anthony, the more he's encouraging me to be a doctor." And I think I would enjoy that. And in fact, the doctor talked to him many times about becoming a doctor. And then finally he says, "Is it finances that bothers you to becoming a doctor? If so," he says, "I will pay for all of your education, and you can return the money, you can pay it back after you graduate." Well, that sounded pretty good to me, to my father. It sounded pretty good to Doris, not to me, to Doris. And so he decided to accept the doctor's offer. And he and his father, they parted there, his father and mother. He was on the boat on his way to London. He had 100 silver or golden coins jingling in his pocket, and he was ready to have life, decide on a life to live. He wanted to live. Well, when he got to Aberdeen, started enrolling in the school there, he found that the money went pretty fast, and the studies were hard. He had eye trouble. He wasn't able always to study as well as he liked to. And when he finished the first year, he found that there was one subject he had to repeat. Well, this bothered him. He thought, well, maybe I can take it during the summer period. But right in the middle of the summer, he got a notice from Dr. Anthony that he had had bad financial reverses and he would not be able to give him the money for another year to study. But he said, I could make a contract with you, and if you'd like to continue. But there was just no way for him to get word from South Africa with the money for another year. It was too late. Well, his father and mother heard about his difficulties, and they said, well, come and study in Melbourne, Australia. They've got a good school here. They'll accept your credits from Aberdeen. And so they sent him a ticket. And this was an answer to his prayers again. He signed up for school there in Melbourne, the school there. And again, he had eye trouble. And he was sickly some of the time during that year. And so at the end of the year, there was one subject, an important subject, that he didn't quite make the grade. And so the college said, you have to repeat the whole year. And this, of course, my dad says, that's impossible. I can't do that. I'll have to give up deciding to be a doctor. And instead, he went and started working in the new sanitarium that our people were building in Sydney. But it was about this time that he got a call from Willie White, was up at Avondale College, and they were having a lot of work for Ellen White to do there, writing, and he knew that my father knew typing and shorthand, both. He had learned it to please his own father when he was just a young boy. And so he was asked to come and be a secretary for Ellen White. Well, that sounded like something that he could do in the meantime when he was deciding just what he was going to take. And he accepted the position. And but then he began to worry a little bit. He'd never met Ellen White. And he began to wonder, oh, you know, I've heard stories about how she can read into people's lives. And my daddy pictured Ellen looking into his heart and in his own words, seeing the depravity there. And so the day that he came and met Ellen White, he was just really on pins and needles. But she invited him in, greeted him with a hearty handshake, and she said, it's so good to have a man in the house. Well, that sounded good. Then she asked him to say the blessing, and that was an ordeal, Daddy said, but he got through that. And then, you know how they served the meals around the table there. And Sarah McIntyre, who was Ellen White's longtime nurse, secretary, and companion, she came in with a dish of greens just for Ellen. No one else had the greens. And Ellen had greens almost every day, but Sarah hated them. And so as she put the dish down in front of Ellen White, she says, well, Mother, here's your horse feed. And Daddy was shocked. How could anybody talk to Sister White like that? And he watched. He wanted to see if it kind of upset her in any way. But Ellen White kind of looked around the table, got a little twinkle in her eye, and she said, Sorrow, I don't know as my horse feed is any worse than your cow's peas. There was a dish of cow peas on the table. Well, Daddy just was so amazed. He could see that she was a real person and that she had a sense of humor. And, you know, it just made all the difference in the world. He felt so much more at home there. And they asked him also, while he was there, they were planning to go to the States soon. This was in the year 1900. And Ellen had been in Australia for 9 years, and the whole family, God was calling them back to America. But there was a lot to do, and so Father started working for her, copying the book Christ Object Lessons. He typed it out to get that finished publication as soon as possible. And in the meantime, they gave him a room there with a W.C. White family. Well, that was rather nice. And it just happened that the room where he had his typewriter and office was the quiet one in the house. And this is also where Willie White's oldest daughter, Ella, she often came in and did her studying there because it was quiet. And he also had a chance to help her on algebra, and they got acquainted. He was 21, she was 18, almost 18. But it wasn't long before they had to say goodbye. They had to part. And they exchanged pictures, and they promised to write, and he didn't see her again for several more years after that. My brother Virgil wrote the story of Daddy's life. And he's such a good writer that I want to read a little bit of the story that happened while he was working for Ellen White, while he was typing for Ellen White. One evening, after the day's work was over, Doris was reading in his room. Came a knock at the door. He hastened to open it. There was E.W. Farnsworth, his beloved uncle, entered. He hadn't seen his uncle since the Melbourne days. They visited a while, and then Uncle Farnsworth said, "What are you going to do with the rest of your life, Doris?" Well, he explained his mess that he was in with the medical course, and it seems a great pity to me, his uncle said, that you couldn't go back and finish your medical course in Aberdeen, Scotland. And he says, my wife and I, we don't have children. We've saved up some money, and we would be more than happy to buy you a ticket and to take care of your expenses for you to go back to Aberdeen and finish your doctor's course. Oh, this sounded wonderful to Daddy. And but he said, I would like to also talk it over with Ellen White and with Mom and Dad and Willie, and see what they think of the idea too. And they saw no reason why it wasn't just a great idea. And so a few weeks later, he goes down to Sydney, buys a ticket back to Aberdeen, Scotland. The very next day, Doris caught a train for Sydney and bought the ticket for the following week. And with this ticket in his pocket, I'm going to read a little bit here from what brother wrote. Caught the ticket, with a ticket in his pocket. He returned to Cornbong, where he packed his things preparatory to leaving for Sydney on Sunday. While he was completing a big pile of personal correspondence, one of the young lady's secretaries entered the room where he was working and handed him an envelope addressed to D.E. Robinson. Quickly he opened it, glanced at the last page where he saw the signature of Ellen White. Suddenly he realized that he was receiving a personal testimony, similar to those that he had written out so many others in the church. Never for a second did he question as to whether the message was from the Lord. The first sentence fairly took his breath away. You asked me at one time what I thought in regard to your becoming a physician. You asked me at one time what I thought in regards to your becoming a physician. I would say that the most useful lessons for you to learn will not be found in taking a medical course of study. It was a long testimony, 8 pages actually, and it pointed out many weaknesses in Doris's makeup. He had been a great student, delighting in mathematics, languages, and other subjects. He read on, your mind needs to take a more practical turn than it has yet done. But what really shook him was the following sentence. The love of ease, and I may say of physical laziness, will unfit a man to become a physician or a minister. No man is prepared to enter upon a medical course of study until he has learned to earn his bread by the sweat of his brow. Doris knew that, judged by that last statement, he was not qualified to become a doctor. His fees at school had always been paid by someone else, and now for the first time he was earning a small wage. But to take the medical course, he would need a lot of financial help, and he still owed Dr. Anthony for the year that he had had already. So he turned back to page 1 and he read the whole story over again. He found some of the words extremely unflattering: drone, physical inaction, stern, severe discipline, self-indulgent laziness. His first reaction was to try and work out some kind of an accommodation. He would continue his medical course, but he would get more exercise. He would walk in the woods. He would secure an exercise machine, such as those used at the Battle Creek Sanitarium. And the message was plain. It was of no use. He read the testimony for the 3rd time. The message was plain. The most useful lessons for you to learn will not now be found in taking a medical course of study. There could be no compromise with that last statement. He would have to give up his plan to ever take medicine. Then he remembered the ticket in his pocket. It had said the time for getting a return on his ticket was already passed. And he prayed over the matter. He said, "Oh Lord, if you want me to give up my medical career, help me get my money back from the steamship company." Well, where do you suppose he went on Sunday? In fact, the next day after he received that message was Sabbath. And Ellen White preached. Guess what she preached about? Everything that the Lord had shown her in regards to the testimony she had given Doris. And of course, he knew there was no way he could go against the Lord's doing. But he did pray there would be some way, maybe, that he could get the money back. So on Sunday, he heads for Sydney, and he stands in front of the ticket office. "What can I do for you?" came the question. "My name is Doris Robinson, and I am booked to leave for London by Thursday steamer." "Oh, yes, we're glad to reach you. We've been trying to get in touch with you. We've had to cancel your passage because Her Highness has taken the flight to transport troops to South Africa, where the fighting of the Boer War is going on, and we'll have to schedule you with another ticket." Well, he says, "That won't suit me. I'd like to have my money back." So, of course, they returned him his money fully, and he said, "Lord, it seems that I am doing the right thing." He left the building, still amazed at how quickly that God had answered his prayer. And of course, he gave the money back to his uncle, went on back to help the Whites get ready to leave for America. And it was several weeks later that Ellen White called on Elder and Mrs. Robinson, Asa Robinson, Doris's father, where she gave them information that was not found in the testimony itself, information about the vision. In a night vision, she had seemed to be in a room where a number of young men were talking together about their plans for future life work. She saw the angel put his arm on Doris's shoulder and ask what his plans were. When he replied that he intended to become a doctor, the angel solemnly said, "Unless you change your course, Instead of becoming a doctor, you will have to be doctored. 3 weeks later, Doris Robinson suffered a complete nervous breakdown. For more than a month, he lay flat on his back in bed. And just think, what would have happened if he were on his way to Aberdeen or already there with no help? Nobody knows. Might have lost his life. That's exactly what Ellen White the angel had told Ellen White. Well, after he recovered, he did recover eventually, and he began to work in the Sydney hospital. But the thing of it is, what work could he do? Are you a bricklayer? Asked Dr. Merritt Kellogg, who was in charge of building the Sydney hospital. No, I'm not a bricklayer. Very well then, what can you do? There was nothing he could do. You shall have to mix the mortar and carry it to the masons. So that became his task. Sometimes the builders became impatient, felt he should bring the mortar faster. Hurry up and bring that mortar, they would shout. Doris hurried as fast as possible. One day, Dr. Kellogg invited him, Doris, to give a health lecture in the parlor to the patients, and Doris agreed. During the course of the day, he casually mentioned to the Masons that there would be an illustrated lecture in the parlor that evening in the patient's parlor, and he invited them to attend. For the occasion, Doris, dressed in his university gown with the mortarboard on his head. How astonished the Masons were to see their hod carrier dressed like that, like a doctor. They listened attentively to his interesting lecture. From that day on, there was no more swearing at the hod carrier. Instead, it was, Mr. Professor, may we have a little more hod, please? During the months that he worked for Sister White, I've already said this, so skip that. That's when he worked for Ellen White, and they formed a friendship. And it wasn't long before Doris had gained 20 pounds in weight and had gained 2 inches in girth between his shoulders. He was now doing what God had instructed him to do. But he still wanted to have something to do with the medical line of work. And someone suggested that he goes and studies under Dr. Kellogg at the Battle Creek Sanitarium there. And so Daddy worked a while until he got money to pay his way, and he started studying under Dr. Kellogg there. This was in 1900. In fact, it was 1901 that after he finished studying a few months. And at the General Conference of 1901, we have that beautiful picture, you know, of Ellen White standing up, giving her message to the conference. Well, down at the seat below, right, looking up at the pulpit, there are a little table with 2 stenographers there. And one of them was my 21-year-old Doris, father-to-be. I love that picture. I wonder why. I loved my daddy. He was such a wonderful, interesting person. He spoke big words. He was an editor, actually, and more than he was a teacher, but he was also an editor, and he loved the big words. One, though, that I didn't like was when I would do something dumb, and he'd say, "Oh, you little idiot." But the way he said it, I knew he didn't really mean it, like it sounded. But I remember that. And I remember holding him on my knee in Africa, in a rocking chair, and singing to me, you know, songs about the sunshine, Good morning, Mary Sunshine. How did you? So the songs he loved to sing to me. He was a wonderful daddy. Well, he couldn't finish going out to school without earning enough money, and he didn't have very much money. Nobody earned much at Battle Creek. And so he consulted with Dr. Kellogg, and Dr. Kellogg suggested he go to Montana and sell books. Give him special price on some of the medical books. And that's what Daddy did. But he found the winter very hard there, and it wasn't long before he got sick. He wasn't doing very many selling of books. And after a family took him in, he had sort of rheumatoid arthritis, actually, and a family took him and nursed him back to health in Montana there. And it was at this time that he knew he had to get some work once he recovered, and he began teaching a school there, an Adventist church school in Montana. And that was when he received a letter from Willie White telling him that the work at Elms Haven was just becoming overwhelming, and Ellen White needed him to come and be a secretary again. Well, it didn't take Daddy too long to wind up his school teaching and be back in 1903 back at Elms Haven and enjoying working again for Ellen White. And once again, he met a young lady that he had admired in Australia, And they had exchanged a few pictures, but not much. She was busy going to Healdsburg College. She was taking a teaching course. She wanted to be a teacher. She wanted to be an outstanding teacher, you know. Mama was always had big ideas. Not only for herself, but a lot of other people too. She was always looking at people and giving them ideas of what they ought to do. And she was famous for that, Mother was. She had a mind of her own, I tell you, she did. And they began, you know, getting their acquainted again. And after she graduated, she went to summer school and found that there was a school in Reno that needed a teacher. Well, she'd had 3 weeks of training there. At that time, they were getting ready to write some textbooks. Our school plan was just beginning. Our church school plan was just beginning as a denomination. And so she didn't realize what she was getting into, actually. School had closed. Ella White had her teaching certificate and a school to teach in the fall of 1904. Doris was 25 years old. Wasn't it time for him to marry and establish a home of his own? He thought so, and so did W.C. White. Other members of the family expressed their sentiments as being in agreement with his. Unfortunately, the only girl he admired didn't seem interested. Ella White had attended a teachers' convention that summer and was thrilled at the idea of teaching a school of her own. When she was invited to teach the Reno Church School that winter, she was delighted and quickly accepted. I intend to improve until I am the best primary teacher it is possible for me to be, the ambitious young lady informed the young man. In response to a pertinent question, she admitted liking him a lot. And it seemed quite likely that someday she'd say yes, but not yet. How long must I wait? Doris finally asked, rather exasperated by the vagueness of her matrimonial plans. Oh, perhaps 5 years, was her reply. Do you realize that by then you will be 27 and I'll be 30? What does that matter? She replied. We'll have, with a toss of her head, we'll have all the rest of our lives to live together. Well, Doris remarked ruefully, if Jacob could wait 7 years, I suppose I can wait 5. So Ella made her preparations, and in September she set out for Reno. Her sister Mabel went with her to teach the kindergarten children, and they would live and work together. Promise me that you're going to write regularly, Doris pleaded as he bade her goodbye. I'm going to be pretty busy, she replied, but I will write as often as I can. During the months that followed, Doris lived from one mail day to a nest, always the first at the mailbox, see if there was any post from Reno. Ella's letters were full of enthusiasm about her work. She was really enjoying it, and Mabel was having a wonderful time teaching the beginners. Ella fully expected that they would ask her to teach another year. Doris was perplexed, to say the least. He had hoped after living through a Reno winter, she would be cured of her burning ambition to be a professional teacher. And now it seemed that that was all she could think about, was her teaching. Could he wait 4 more years? When he decided he couldn't, and he wouldn't, he decided to go and see her. And so in the spring, he went on the midnight train up to Reno, arrived there early in the morning. And one Sunday, she was preparing lesson plans, and he knocked on the door. Well, she was kind of surprised to see him. It was nice. We were glad to see him. And he had only the day, so they went and visited in his hotel lobby there, where people couldn't be seen by any of her students. She didn't want to be seen talking to a man by any of her students. So, how long could you stay? Well, I have to be back to the office tomorrow morning. But you know how the work piles up, and so I have to take the westbound train at 5 o'clock tonight. But where can we go? We have lots of things to talk over. They began to reminisce a little bit. And finally, Ella was telling him stories about when she heard he was coming for a visit. She ran away to the woods and missed her chance at meeting an excellent young man a year before she actually met him. Let's not worry about the past, Doris said, coming to the point. Let's rather talk about the future. I have decided that we should not wait 4 more years. Do you love me enough to marry me this year? And then I've copied a little paragraph that my mother wrote. As he slipped his arm around me and his eyes looked into mine, I knew that the great moment had come. There in that hotel, we settled the question. I still wanted to teach 1 more year, and with a little more persuasion, I agreed to shorten the waiting period from 5 years to 1. That weighty question settled, our mutual promises were made, which we sealed with a fervent kiss, our first. That afternoon, Ella said goodbye, and she was happy, she was thrilled. Here she was engaged, didn't know when they were to be married, but she was engaged. Then, all of a sudden, winter turned into spring, and this was 1905, and there was to be a general conference in Tacoma Park, Maryland. Back in St. Helena, there was a bustle in the air as plans were laid for attending the coming general conference to be held in Tacoma Park, Maryland. Although Ellen White was 78 years of life, she fully intended to be present. Important issues were at stake, and she had messages that had to be delivered. Ordinarily, Miss Sarah McInturfer, who was her companion, secretary, just went with her, took care of her most of her life, devoted her life to Ellen White, was too sick, and she would not be able to go with Ellen to Washington. When Sister White learned of this, she told Willie, she said, you know who I would like? My second choice would be for your wife to go, Ethel May Lacy White. But how could this happen? How could that happen? W.C. White, he didn't see how his wife could possibly go. Not only was there a big house with its many boarders to care for, but there were also 3 lively children to be had and mother's attention. Grace was only 5. The twins were 9. And they boarders there. There was work to do in a house like that. That was the problem. And at first, there was no solution. No one came up with a solution. Living and boarding in the big white house, Doris knew all about the problem facing the family. One day, I don't think it took too long, the solution came to him. It was one that appealed to him strongly, and he laid the situation as he saw it before W.C. White. You can see W.C. White and Doris were close. If Ella is willing to get married this year, we can take care of the children, the boarders, and the house too. Then your wife can go with you to Tacoma Park. W.C. White thought it was an excellent plan and wondered why he had not thought of it himself. The question remained, however, as to whether all of the parties could be brought to agreement. Time was running out. They must leave for the conference in only 6 weeks, and he wondered what his eldest daughter would think of the plan. Her first reaction when the matter was laid before her was negative. She had made up her plan and she was going to stick to it. Then she began to receive letters from Doris, from her father and mother. She even received one from her grandmother asking just who Ella White thought she was. Ella dropped her opposition. She arranged with the school board to close her school by the middle of April. And that done, she hastened home. Frantically, she plunged into preparations for her wedding. Sunday, May 1, found everyone busy. Doris had built a bower with a wedding bell made of roses on the lawn in front of Elmshaven. As the hour for the wedding drew near, the sky became black with clouds. It hardly seemed possible that California, that land which receives its rains usually in the winter, it was actually going to have an afternoon shower. And so, of course, they had to move up to the sanitarium chapel. But they were duly married, and the very next day they started packing the folks things for them to leave. They left on Wednesday after the wedding was on Sunday. And of course, Ella and Doris, they didn't have any honeymoon, but they helped to get them off for the General Conference session of 1905. My grandson Justin Terosian, he's recently told me that they have discovered a very unusual picture of Willie and his wife and Ellen dressed nicely and it was taken at the General Conference session of 1905. And I thought that was really, really interesting because my parents had their wedding brought about in a wonderful way because Ellen White needed to have it done. And so it was done. And I've loved that story. I just love that story. My mother said she never regretted giving up that extra year. She was just so thankful that she had as many years together with Daddy as she had, because he was truly a gem of a husband and of a father. He was really a gem of a person. You know, the mission field of Africa has always been a favorite of mine. And as I grew up, you know, I said, someday I want to be a missionary and go to Africa. Well, my brother did go. And in fact, 4 generations of the A.T. Robinson family spent in mission term in Africa. But not Gladys Kubrock. I did spend 10 years in Iran and 6 years in Lebanon. We were missionaries there, but that's another story. I'm going to go back now to when I was just a little girl in Africa. And I would go with Mommy to her classes because she taught, and I would draw pictures on the wall and just amuse myself as best I could when school was on. But my brother and sister were older, and they went to the boarding school we had in Africa there. They made a couple of terms there. But they came home, and there was just not enough money to send them back to boarding school. And so they stayed home for a year and studied their books at home, Mother helping them. But they were getting on in years. Virgil was 17, and Mabel was 3 years younger. And Mother wanted them to get on with their education. She didn't want them to keep losing because of that. So she asked, our furlough was due in 1928. And so the year before, my parents had requested the mission that if they could go home a year early. But they said the budget had been allocated for that year, and they had no money to send them to this year. They would have to wait till next year. That was not okay with my mother. And Daddy had a little Model A Ford. And Mother was great at selling books. She had done it for years to earn extra money just to live. And so she and Virgil knew how to drive. And so she went and got a lot of books from book headquarters. And she went to all those people working in the mines, the gold mines. And she raised the money together with Virgil. It took her about 3 months to raise enough money to send Virgil and Mabel ahead of us, ahead of the rest of us for a year. And I have the cutest little letter. I was 5 years old when I wrote it, that I wrote to my mother and sister telling them goodbye. I have that cutest little letter. It was hard to say goodbye, my brother and sister. That last year was real hard on the mission for all of us. It was hard for Mom and Dad. But they did get home, and they stayed and lived with Grandpa White, Grandpa Willie White. They went to the Sanitarium Church School. Well, finally the day came when we had to say goodbye. And I'll never forget, I was only 6 years old, I'll never forget the tears that were shed when the students and the faculty, when they had to say goodbye, especially to my daddy. They said, Mufandisi Robinson, there will never be another Mufandisi that we will like better, love better. And that impressed me a lot, of how much they loved my dad. I guess they loved Mom too, but I only remember loving my daddy. I think it's because I love my daddy so much. And we knew that this would, well, no, Daddy wanted to come back. He loved it on the mission. Those were the best 4 years that he'd spent when he was teaching there, principal of the school. And so they packed all their goods as if they were going to come back. And but he did want to go through Egypt. He wanted to go home through Egypt. And that was where we saw those pyramids. I saw my first glimpse of the pyramids. And there were camels there. And the camels were kneeling down. And they asked me, do you want to ride on a camel? Well, they put me on a camel, whether I wanted to or not. And all of a sudden, here was the knees going up. The camel was getting up, first one knee and then the other knee. I was scared, silly. I don't know, I screamed so much that I'm sure they took me off. I never asked whether I rode the camel or not. But that was my experience with the camel. And then we went to Rome. We visited St. Peter's, the cathedral there. That was an experience too. And of course, my parents didn't pay any money. They didn't go on a tour to kiss the toe of the Pope. But I'll never forget that grand cathedral. It was awesome. It was really awesome. But when we visited other cathedrals and we visited museums, I was only 6 years old. And one of the first things that gave me a terrible feeling was seeing a man, the traffic in Rome was horrible, and I saw a man hit and killed right on the streets there. I'll never forget it. It was so, I cried for hours. It seemed like death was still new, fairly new to me. But I've always hated museums and art galleries. Guess why? But I have a daughter who became an artist. Your mother. She's a beautiful artist.
You can say.
But nothing that had anything to do with me. Oh, anyway, eventually we got to South Lancaster, where Grandpa Asa Robinson had been retired, and he was living there. We stayed there for 6 months, and then we drove to California. Daddy bought us Studebaker, and we drove across America. What a trip. No fancy hotels, motels, and we just camped beside a park or someplace, you know. And I remember we slept on the shore of the Salt Lake, right on it was just salt, all salt. And we went swimming there too. That was an experience. You can't go down, can't get anywhere. But eventually we got to Loma Linda, and then from Loma Linda we saw relatives there, and then we drove up to Elmshaven. And it wasn't long before Grandpa White said, Doris, you are not going back to Africa. Daddy really, in a way, he felt disappointed. In a way, he did. But Grandpa White had for years, after Ellen White's death, she had not even a secretary to carry on the work that his mother had left him with five men in charge of bringing out more books. And it was as if the whole General Conference had breathed a big sigh of relief, and no more messages for a while, no more testimonies for a while. But eventually, the Lord began to, bring things back. And so Grandpa White was busy there. Arthur White had come of age, and he was working there in the office at Elmshaven. And so Daddy was captured. he could not go back to Africa. And for Mother, one of the biggest things that were made her so sad was the fact that the piano we had left in Africa. Mother always loved music. She was the musician sort of the family. And fortunately, we found somebody on their way to Africa, and they had a piano in San Francisco. And we switched. They took ours in Africa, we took theirs. So we got another piano soon after that, because I love piano. I did. That was one of the things I really, my fingers would tingle if I was away from a piano for more than 2 or 3 days. I just love to get back and working on piano. So, but we asked for the books to be sent. Daddy had packed up all boxes of books. And you know, they came in pitiful condition because of the white ants in Africa. They had chewed the books, the backs of the books. We had to get rid of a lot of them. We had Aunt Grace's husband, the story, you know, of from Russia, Uncle John's book. It was all in pieces, just shreds. We kept it for years and years, though. It was a wonderful souvenir. But we settled. Daddy built a house there in not too far from the Elms Haven itself, right at the foot of the hill by the bridge. Daddy built a house there. Mother, they had to borrow money to do that, and Mother had to go out and sell books, but she did. She'd go up in the Rockies there and sell books. She always filled in with because Daddy worked for very low wages for Ellen White. Daddy and Mother had to make a lot of sacrifices. And all our pioneers made sacrifices, tremendous sacrifices. And Willie would ride 3rd class. He didn't take a sleeping car. Yeah. They were really true pioneers, really self-sacrificing pioneers. For a while, we actually lived in Grandpa White's house. It was a sort of 3 stories, although the 3rd story was just a, attic room. And there were several apartments there, and Daddy and Mother and I, and Virgil and Mabel. Yes, we were reunited to my brother and sister. I'm forgetting about that. Oh, how can I not remember what that meeting was, because it must have been truly wonderful. My big second mama, Mabel. And it's unfortunate that our lives have been lived, for the most part, separated. But that's this life. Heaven is going to be different. And so Mabel went to the Sanitarium Church School, and I started to there, the 1st grade. I remember I loved 1st grade. And my 2 uncles, the twins, Henry and Herbert White, they had been missionaries in China for 7 years. And they returned in 1929, just after we had been back for about a year. And so I remember I had 2 cousins in the 1st grade with me. Because you see, the twins, they were a lot younger than my mother was, but at the same time, I was born when my mother was 40 years old. And my brother and sister were older, and they knew Ellen White. I never saw her because I was born too late. But I had a lot of cousins around. The twins Henry had 3 children, and Herbert had 2 children, and they were just my age. Catherine White was 6 months older, and another cousin, Willie White, was 6 years younger. 6 months younger. 6 months older, 6 months younger. And so we enjoyed being together. We had a lot of time. We had family reunions. We'd have dinners together there. And there is one picture. I know that you've seen that one with all the family gathered together. Yeah, I was 8 years old at that time. That's a picture that everybody knows that picture, I'm sure.
So, Aunt Daphne, was she living in the area too?
Well, she was Henry's and Herbert, and they both settled in that area because Henry's wife was also from Angwin, and so when they got home from China, they settled there, and Herbert lived there for a while too. Well, everybody lived there for a while. I got really well acquainted with my cousins there. We were a happy family. And we would have maybe twice in the summer, at least once in the summer, we would plan on a picnic, a whole picnic at the Russian River. And go near Healdsburg there. Oh, I can remember getting ready for it because we'd make ice cream. And all the cousins would turn the cranks, on the ice cream. And they'd have ice. Would have to be salted. The ice would be salted. And then, of course, licking the dasher. There was always a quarrel about who gets to lick the next dasher. And then we would all go and we had automobiles by that time. We didn't have to go in horse and buggy. But we would go and we would get there as early as we could. We'd get up really early and get the ice cream going really early. But when we got there, we'd hope it would be we'd hope for a day of well, we would get there 9 or 10 o'clock. And there would be anywhere from 25 to 30 family members, because the relatives would come in too, of all the children. And we would swim. They had rafts. There was rafts there. Oh, they had so much fun on the rafts. But what I remember almost the best of all, and you will see it in the picture, I can show you one of the pictures I have it showing. I have one downstairs, I think. Anyway, what I liked best was the huge slide. Huge slide. You'd climb up the steps, and then you'd go zoom. Oh, I was scared at first, terribly scared, but I got to loving it eventually. I got to loving it. And my brothers and sisters, and Arthur and Frida, they were just going together. They weren't married yet. And Francis was, of course, younger than Virgil. He was younger than Mabel, Francis was, but he was our uncle. And he let us remember that. He was our uncle, Uncle Francis White. He was the baby of Ellen's family, of Willie's family. And he was fun, too. He had 3 buddies that he would go around with, 4 of them. And they were just go everywhere, everything. Grandpa Willie was 60 years old when Francis was born. And so we had lots of prayers for Francis. Lots of prayers for Francis. But thank God, he sort of woke up and he married the right person for him. God saw to it that he married a beautiful woman, had never had a date. Francis was her first date. But we loved her. We learned to love her. And they have the youngest grandchildren, great-grandchildren. They have them.
When you were there on those family vacations, would Grandpa Willie also play with you?
Oh, yes. Well, not so much on the Russian River Day, but at home, at Rosehaven. Now, Willie White's house was Willie White's house when he built it and lived there. But after he died, it was sold, and then later it was bought back, and now it's a nursing home. It's called Rosehaven. They added to the building, and it is a nursing home today, Willie's house. But there was lots of acreage around there, and that's where we would get together, and it was on the top of the hill. We'd go down the hill and then up to Elmshaven. We'd go down the hill. Now you can't do that anymore. They've done away with, they've built houses there. Things have changed. But we had all kinds of places to play and hide, and one of our favorite games was hide and seek. And all of the grandchildren loved Grandpa because he loved them. And he would tell stories. Oh, we just gathered together. Grandpa, come, Grandpa's going to tell a story. Grandpa's going to tell a story. And he would tell different stories about his growing up and about other stories that he'd heard about, mission stories. He was just a wonderful storyteller, and he loved to play tag with us. I can still, in my mind's eye, I can still see him kind of hiding behind a tree there, maybe counting, because it was his turn to be it. He was a dear. He was deaf, though. He was so deaf, and he could only hear when we were talking about him. But he could hear. He sensed it. He knew when we were talking about Grandpa. Oh, we used to get a big kick out of that. Oliver was the oldest, Oliver Jacques. And he and Grandpa got along really good together. Good friends.